We are examining a case today that serves as a definitive and I think really sobering case study in forensic anomaly.
It absolutely is.
The subject is the disappearance and eventual identification of two teenage girls, Kerry Ann Graham and Francine Marie Trimble.
And this all begins in Forestville, California, back in December of 1978.
It's a case that forces us to look very closely at the intersection of, well, law enforcement procedure and forensic anthropology.
It really does. I mean, we often view science as this absolute itching criminal investigations. Fingerprints match or they don't. DNA is unique or it isn't.
Right, it's black and white.
Exactly. But this specific case, it really demonstrates the fragility of the justice system when it relies on human interpretation of biological data. I mean, what you have here are two teenage girls who vanished.
Inseparable friends.
Inseparable. And their remains were actually discovered relatively quickly, within about 7 months of their disappearance. And yet they remained unidentified for 36 years.
36 years. It's an almost unbelievable length of time.
It is. And the reason for this delay, it wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a lack of evidence. It was a fundamental error in osteology, the study of bones.
A scientific misclassification.
Yes. That misclassification effectively erased these two girls from the official record. It sent investigators on a hunt for victims who, simply did not exist.
For our discussion today, we're basing this on a collection of primary and secondary sources.
We are.
These include sheriff's reports from both Mendocino and Sonoma counties, the original forensic files from the late 1970s, as well as media coverage specifically surrounding the BBC series Naming the Dead.
And we're also drawing from the book Lay Them to Rest, which was published in 2023 and gives a very comprehensive account.
So what's the primary objective of our analysis today? What are we trying to understand here?
The mission really is to reconstruct the timeline. We want to go from their early lives all the way to the resolution in 2016. But I think more importantly, we need to deconstruct the error.
The mistake itself.
Yes. We need to understand the sociology of 1970s California that allowed them to disappear in the first place. Then, the limitations of 1979 forensic anthropology that led to this misidentification. And finally, the technological evolution that decades later finally corrected the record.
So we'll be looking at how science and human error really played this massive role in delaying justice.
And we will examine the current status of what is still a very open homicide investigation.
Let's begin then with the biographies of the victims. It's crucial to establish the context of their lives before 1978. Can you provide the background on Kerry Ann Graham?
Certainly. Kerry Ann Graham was born on November 12, 1963 in Orange County, California. So at the time she disappeared, she was 15 years old.
Okay.
In terms of her family structure, she was the youngest of 3 children. Her parents were Herbert and Mary Ann Graham. She had an older brother, Ronald, who was born in 1957, and an older sister, Kelly, born in 61.
And what was the family dynamic like?
The reports describe the Graham family as, quite stable and reasonably wealthy. They lived in Forestville, California, which is a small community in Sonoma County. So a fairly comfortable upbringing.
And what about her personality? What do the sources say?
The information we have characterizes Kerry as the dominant personality in her social circle. She's described as confident, very outspoken, and also notably temperamental. A leader, not a follower.
And it's important to look at her history because that directly shaped the initial police response, didn't it?
It absolutely did. Kerry, and actually her siblings as well, had a documented history of running away from home during their teenage years.
Which would immediately raise red flags for police, or rather lower them.
Exactly. It makes them think, oh, it's just happening again. But this behavior needs to be contextualized. These were, by all accounts, brief episodes. She would leave for a short period, maybe after a family dispute or just out of a desire for independence. But the pattern was that she always came back.
So it wasn't a permanent break from the family?
No, not at all. But there is a critical physical detail about her in December 1978 that really argues against a runaway scenario.
And what's that?
Kerry had recently undergone an appendectomy, a major abdominal surgery. She was still in the recovery phase.
Okay.
The sources are clear that she had been prescribed antibiotics to prevent any postoperative infection. When investigators eventually checked her room, they found that she had left her antibiotics at home.
Why is that detail so significant to the investigation?
Well, it's significant because it speaks to her intent. If a 15-year-old girl is planning a long-term departure, if you're running away to start a new life or travel for a long time, you don't leave behind the medication that is essential for your recovery.
Right, you'd take that with you.
You absolutely would. Leaving the antibiotics strongly suggests that she only intended to be gone for a short time, maybe just a few hours for that shopping trip she mentioned. She fully expected to return home that evening to take her next dose.
It's a piece of physical evidence that just doesn't align with the theory that she left voluntarily for good.
It's a direct contradiction to it.
Now let's get the background on her friend, Francine Marie Trimble.
Francine Marie Trimble was born almost a year after Kerry on September 27, 1964, in Novato, California. So she was 14 when they disappeared.
A year younger.
Yes, she was the younger of two children. She had a brother named Andrew, who was born in 1962. And her background, it really offers a sharp contrast to Kerry's.
In what way?
While the Grahams' life was stable and affluent, Francine came from a broken home of very modest means. Her biological father, Ira Trimble, was an alcoholic who abandoned the family shortly before Francine was even born.
So she never really knew him.
No. Consequently, she was raised primarily by her mother, Mary Christine, and then a succession of stepfathers. There were also periods of instability where she was placed in foster care. It was a much more difficult upbringing.
And her personality, how is she described?
She's described as shy and reserved. In the dynamic of her friendship with Kerry, Francine was absolutely viewed as the follower. Kerry was the leader. Francine was the one who went along.
They were in different grades at the time, is that correct?
It is. In late 1978, Francine was in the 8th grade of Forestville School. Kerry, being a year older, had just started her freshman year at El Molino High School.
So despite being at different schools, they were still very close.
Inseparable. Their proximity as next-door neighbors in Forestville is really what kept them so tightly connected.
Can you describe the nature of their association leading up to that December?
As you said, they were neighbors and best friends, and they had been since elementary school. The sources indicate a very high level of, you could say, codependency.
Okay.
If one of the girls wasn't at her own home, she was almost certainly at the other's house. They just moved as a single unit. They were known to be truant together on occasion.
So they got into some trouble together.
A little bit, yes. And this close bond is absolutely central to the whole narrative because they vanished together and, as we'll see, they were eventually found together. Their movements were just completely synchronized.
All right, let's move to the timeline of the disappearance itself. What occurred on December 16th, 1978?
December 16th, 1978 was a Saturday. The girls left their homes with a stated plan. They were going to visit the Coddingtown Mall in Santa Rosa.
And Kerry Graham had told her mother this.
Yes, Kerry specifically told her mother she was going to shop for Christmas gifts. The logistical sequence that investigators pieced together is that Kerry went over to Francine's home first.
Okay.
Francine's family wasn't there when Kerry arrived, so the two girls then left from the Trimble residence together.
And when the investigation began, what did they find at Francine's home?
They analyzed the scene, and there were no signs of a struggle. Crucially, no personal possessions were taken that would indicate they planned to be gone for a long time. No suitcases were missing, no large amounts of clothing were gone. Everything just pointed to a day trip.
But there were witnesses who reported seeing the girls later that day. What did those accounts detail?
There are two primary witness accounts about their movements that day that are considered credible. The first is from a friend, a girl named Eileen Goetz.
And where did she see them?
She reported seeing them on the grounds of El Molino High School, which was Kerry's school. According to Goetz, the girls were just hanging out, smoking cigarettes near the tennis courts.
And did they say where they were going?
Yes. Goetz stated that the girls told her they were planning to hitchhike to a party in Santa Rosa. She even mentioned that they invited her to come with them, but she declined.
And this hitchhiking theory is corroborated.
It is. A second acquaintance reported seeing Kerry and Francine actively hitchhiking near a local Chevron station. This aligns completely with the behavior of the era.
Right, hitchhiking was much more common for teenagers in the 1970s.
It was a very common mode of transport, despite all the obvious risks. The location and the activity, it all suggests they were trying to get a ride toward Santa Rosa, which is consistent with their stated plan to go to the mall or to a party.
So how did the initial search and investigation proceed once they were actually noted as missing?
Well, the reporting of the missing persons cases was staggered, which was a problem from the start.
Okay.
Francine Trimble was reported missing within 24 hours. Her mother realized she hadn't come home and called the police.
But not Kerry.
Not Kerry. Kerry Graham was not reported missing until Christmas Eve. That's a full 8 days later.
And that delay was entirely because of her history of running away.
Directly attributed to it, yes. Her family initially just assumed she might return, just as she had in the past. They viewed it as another episode of teenage rebellion, not a sinister disappearance.
So what was law enforcement's initial reaction?
They categorized the case as a runaway situation. That was the prevailing theory from the police perspective. And it was, as you said, heavily influenced by Kerry's history.
But the families didn't agree.
No, the families strongly suspected foul play or an abduction. They were focused on the lack of any missing possessions, and in Kerry's case, the very serious medical situation with her appendix and the antibiotics she left behind.
So what was their theory?
Family theory was that if they were taken, either from the house or from the roadside, it might have been by someone they knew, or potentially at gunpoint, given that there was no sign of a struggle.
But with no bodies and no crime scene, what could they do?
Very little. The families couldn't entirely rule out that the girls had managed to hitch a ride to some distant location. In that absence of information, speculation just ran wild.
I can imagine.
There were theories that they had somehow hitched all the way to New Jersey or even to Nova Scotia, Canada. But as the weeks turned into months with no leads and zero contact from the girls, the active investigation just waned. It waned. By mid-1979, the case had gone cold.
Let's transition then to the discovery of the remains. This occurred on July 8, 1979. Describe the location where they were found.
The discovery site was in Mendocino County, along Highway 20. This is a pretty rugged east-west road. The specific location is about 12 miles west of the city of Willits.
And how far is that from where the girls lived?
It's roughly 80 miles north of their homes in Forestville. The terrain there is described as very steep, heavily overgrown woodland, specifically near an area called James Creek.
So very remote area.
Exactly the kind of remote area that is often used for the illegal disposal of things, or in this case, bodies.
What were the circumstances of the bodies being found? It was accidental, wasn't it?
Completely accidental. 2 tourists were driving to Fort Bragg. They got into a minor argument in their car and decided to pull over to cool off.
Okay.
One of the tourists got out of the car to walk around, and they ventured into the heavy brush that was along the embankment of the road.
And that's when they saw it.
That's when. While walking there, this individual saw a human skull protruding from a shallow grave in the embankment.
So what did they do?
Well, they didn't have a way to call the police from that spot, so they had to be resourceful. They marked the location by leaving a soda can at the roadside to act as a marker for the authorities.
And then they drove for help.
Yes, then they drove into Willits to notify the police.
So what did the crime scene examination reveal about the condition of the remains?
The Mendocino County Sheriff's deputies, along with the FBI, they conducted a very comprehensive search of that whole embankment. They managed to recover about 90% of the skeletal remains.
And their condition?
The bodies were completely unclothed and had been reduced to a skeletal state. This was due to the roughly 7 months of exposure to the elements and, of course, to local wildlife.
But there is immediate evidence of a homicide.
Oh, yes. The condition of the remains provided that immediately. Duct tape was found. Some of it was adhering to the bones themselves, and some to remaining hair.
Meaning they had been bound.
It clearly indicated the victims had been bound. The bodies had also been concealed inside plastic bags before being buried in that shallow grave. The site showed clear signs of disturbance by wild animals, which would account for why some bones were scattered.
And what was the assessment of the scene?
The assessment was that the murders had been committed somewhere else, at a primary crime scene, and the bodies were then transported to this remote spot for disposal.
Were there any other artifacts found with them?
Only one personal item was recovered. It was a single shell earring. It was described as depicting a bird fashioned in what they called a hippie or Native American style.
And this would later be significant.
It would. This item was eventually linked to Francine Trimble, but at the time, in 1979, it was just another unassigned piece of evidence in an anonymous case.
We now move to the forensic analysis that was conducted between 1979 and 1980. This section contains the critical error that came to define this case for decades. What were the initial autopsy findings?
The initial examination estimated the date of death to be around December 8, 1978. Now, based on decomposition rates, this was an approximation, but it was remarkably close to their actual disappearance date of December 16th.
And the cause of death?
It couldn't be definitively determined. There was just too much decomposition, no soft tissue left. But homicide was the clear classification. Strangulation was considered a likely method of death, though that was unprovable from the skeletal evidence alone.
What about race?
The finding was Caucasian, though there was some uncertainty noted regarding their specific ethnicity.
Okay, now let's break down the critical mistake that was made during the gender identification. This is the absolute core of the mystery.
This is the pivot point of the entire case, you're right. The forensic pathologist at the time correctly identified one set of remains as female. This was the body later identified as Francine.
Okay.
However, the second set of remains, the ones belonging to Kerry Graham, was identified as male.
How does an error like that happen? Can you explain the scientific context?
I can. To understand the error, you have to look at how osteologists determine sex from a skeleton. The differentiation between male and female skeletons relies on something called sexual dimorphism, the physical differences between the sexes.
Right.
These differences are most pronounced in two areas, the pelvis and the skull. In an adult female, the pelvis is wider to accommodate childbirth. The subpubic angle is obtuse, the sciatic notch is wide. In males, the pelvis is much narrower, more heart-shaped.
And the skull?
The skull also has markers. Males generally have more prominent brow ridges, a more robust jaw, and larger mastoid processes, which are the bumps behind your ears.
So where does the problem come in?
The problem arises with adolescence. These clear differences, they only become really distinct after puberty is complete. In early adolescence, say ages 13 to 15, the skeletal structures of females can often appear narrower and more robust traits we typically associate with males.
So a teenage girl's skeleton can resemble a boy's.
To a degree, yes. The pelvic inlet in a young female may not have fully widened to that characteristic adult female shape yet. The pathologist in 1979, he interpreted the skeletal markers of 15-year-old Kerry Graham, specifically her pelvis and skull, as those of a male. He saw a narrow pelvis, and he categorized the remains as belonging to a teenage boy.
And this one misidentification led to a very specific and very wrong assumption about the relationship between the two victims.
It did. It created a cascade of errors. The authorities were presented with a finding. A teenage male and a teenage female, roughly the same age, found buried together in the same grave.
So they made a logical leap.
An understandable but erroneous one. The investigators concluded there was a high probability that the victims were brother and sister. This sibling theory then became the lens through which the entire investigation was viewed from that point on.
And the case files reflected this error.
They did. The remains were labeled as Case File 111-UMCA for the unidentified male and Case File 131-UFCA for the unidentified female. And because the police were now searching for a missing brother and sister pair, they never cross-referenced these files with the missing persons reports for Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble.
They were looking for a boy and a girl, not two girls.
Exactly. The actual victims were invisible to them because the search parameters were fundamentally flawed from day one.
And on top of the gender error, there were also inaccuracies with the height and age estimates.
Yes, which compounded the problem significantly. The anthropological estimates for height were way off, further distancing the remains from the actual victims.
How far off?
For the body that was identified as male, which was Kerry Graham, the estimated height range was recorded as 5 feet 2 inches to 5 feet 11 inches.
And her actual height.
Kerry's actual height in life was 4 feet 9 inches.
That's a huge discrepancy.
It's a massive one. At the lower bound, it's a 5-inch difference. An investigator looking for a male who was potentially almost 6 feet tall would never, ever consider a missing girl who was under 5 feet.
What about for Francine?
For Francine, the height was estimated to be between 5 feet 3 inches and 6 feet tall. Her actual height was likely around 5'5". So while that was closer, the ranges were still very broad and inaccurate.
So you have the wrong gender, inaccurate heights, and this false sibling theory.
It created a description of two phantom victims that made it impossible for anyone looking for Kerry and Francine to make the connection.
Please detail the progression of the case during what's now known as the cold case era, from about 1980 until 2011.
Well, after the initial leads were exhausted, and with no identifications made, the bodies were interred. They were placed in a cement crypt at the Russian River Cemetery in Ukiah.
And the case just went dormant.
It did, for 2 decades. It was completely inactive until the year 2000.
What happened in 2000?
There was a temporary reactivation of the investigation. It was due to a false confession. A prisoner who was incarcerated in New Jersey confessed to the murders.
And that would obviously get their attention.
It did. This development necessitated the first exhumation of the bodies. They needed to see if they could corroborate his story with the evidence.
And could they?
No. The investigation very quickly excluded this individual. They checked his records and found he was only 12 years old at the time of the murders.
And he'd never been to California.
He had never even left the state of New Jersey. It was determined that he had completely fabricated the confession after reading a newspaper article about the case. He was likely seeking attention or maybe a transfer, a change of scenery.
But that exhumation, even though it was for a false lead, proved to be very valuable.
Extremely valuable. It allowed for new forensic analysis with, more modern techniques. A forensic odontologist named Jim Wood was brought in to examine the dentition of the victims. Yes. And Wood was the first expert to officially challenge the prevailing sibling theory. He analyzed the dental charting, the jaw structures, and he concluded they were just too dissimilar to be biologically related.
But he went even further than that, didn't he?
He did. Wood also analyzed the skull of the male victim, and he put forward the suggestion that both of the victims might actually be female, directly contradicting that original 1979 pathology report.
So, 20 years later, someone finally questions the foundational error of the case.
The first official voice to do so, yes.
How is this dental analysis followed up?
In 2001, they conducted mitochondrial DNA analysis. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed down exclusively from the mother to her children.
So if they were siblings, they'd have the same mtDNA.
If they shared the same mother, yes.
Yeah.
The testing was conducted, and it confirmed definitively that the two victims were not maternally related. This scientifically debunks the brother-sister theory once and for all.
So now they have DNA proof they aren't siblings, and a dental expert suggesting they might both be female. That must have changed the investigation.
You would think so. But here's where the institutional inertia is so clear. Despite the DNA evidence proving they weren't siblings, and despite the odontologist's suspicion about the gender, the official records were not immediately corrected.
The file for the male victim stayed male.
The case files retained the male classification. Even the digital facial reconstructions that were generated by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the NCMEC, in the early 2000s, continued to depict one victim as a male and one as a female.
So the image being put out to the public was still wrong?
It was. This persistence of the gender error, it effectively kept the case unsolved. The parameters for any database search remain flawed.
The narrative seems to shift dramatically in the period between 2011 and 2015, and it's because of media involvement. Can you explain the role the BBC played here?
Yes, this is a very distinct aspect of this case, where international media directly drove the forensic process forward. The BBC commissioned a documentary series called Naming the Dead.
And what was the concept of the show?
The concept was to highlight unsolved cold cases in the United States and to showcase the work of the NCMEC. The production company actually paid for a second exhumation of the bodies in 2011, specifically to use this case as a primary subject for the documentary.
So the TV show funded the science?
In essence, yes. And this allowed for the application of much more updated technology. NCMEC created new, state-of-the-art 3D digital reconstructions using CT scans of the skulls. This new analysis also narrowed the age estimation down to 13 to 15 years old, which was much more accurate than the previous broad estimates.
But even with all this new technology, the original error was resilient.
Incredibly resilient. It's important to note that even in 2012, during this whole process for the documentary, the forensic anthropologist involved did not overturn the original conclusion that one of the skulls was male.
So the reconstruction for Kerry was still of a boy.
It was. The reconstruction for Case 111 UMCA was produced and then aired on television, depicting a teenage boy. So the visual that was being broadcast to the world was still a boy and a girl. The public face of the case was still wrong.
So when was the gender misidentification finally officially rectified?
The final breakthrough occurred through DNA testing at the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. They had obtained bone samples following that 2011 exhumation for the BBC.
And what did they find?
In 2014, advanced genetic testing, which was far more sophisticated than what was available in 2001, proved that the remains designated as 111 UMCA, the supposed male, were actually female.
So that was it, the final definitive correction.
That was the pivot point. The profile was now correct for the first time in 35 years. Two teenage females, aged 13 to 15, found together. The phantom brother was finally removed from the equation.
Now connect this forensic correction to the actual identification process involving the families. How did that happen?
Well, the BBC documentary and the subsequent release of those facial reconstructions, even with one of them being depicted as male, they generated a lot of renewed public interest in the case.
Oh.
Kerry Graham's sister saw the re-aired and released media about the case, and she noted the details, the location in Mendocino, the timeline of late 1978. And it sparked a connection for her.
And she reached out to authorities?
She contacted them, and she emphasized a crucial point. Her sister had disappeared not alone and not with a boy, but with a female friend, Francine.
And now, with the gender correction finally in the case file, investigators could see that connection.
For the first time, they could make the logical link. They were no longer looking for siblings. They were looking for two female friends. So they collected DNA samples from the Graham and the Trimble families.
And compared them to the unidentified remains.
Yes, they were compared against the profiles that were now in the NCMSE database.
Which brings us to the resolution in 2015 and 2016. Can you detail the confirmation and the official statements that were made?
In November of 2015, the DNA comparison yielded a formal match. The remains that were found all the way back in 1979 were positively identified as Kerry Ann Graham and Francine Marie Trimble.
And this was announced publicly.
It was. The Mendocino and Sonoma County Sheriff's Offices held a joint press conference in February of 2016 to announce the resolution of this decades-old mystery.
And did they address the reason for the 36-year delay?
They did, quite directly. During the briefing, the sheriffs explicitly admitted that the classification of one body as male and the subsequent sibling theory were the primary reasons the missing persons reports for the girls were never linked to the bodies.
So they owned the mistake.
They explained that for decades, all the database queries had been run for a male and female pair. They also noted another complicating factor. Data entry errors in some national databases had listed the wrong year of disappearance.
What do you mean?
Some databases had them disappearing in 1979 instead of 1978, which would have further complicated any automated matches, even if the genders had been correct.
What was the reaction from the families after all that time?
The families expressed a mixture of, I think, relief and resignation. They were relieved to finally have answers after 36 years of just uncertainty.
The not knowing.
The not knowing, which is so often described as the hardest part for families of missing people. But at the same time, they had largely resigned themselves to the fact that foul play had occurred, just given the sheer passage of time.
And the identification allowed for the remains to be returned.
It did. In February 2016, the bodies were finally released to the families for proper burial, allowing them to finally lay the girls to rest after nearly 4 decades.
There was one other anomalous piece of evidence mentioned in the forensic reports. A tooth. Can you explain that detail?
Yes, that's a strange loose end in this case. During the examination of the remains, a single tooth was discovered that did not belong to either Kerry or Francine.
And they were able to analyze it.
They were. Forensic analysis of this tooth indicated it came from an individual of Asian or Native American heritage.
So what's the theory there? Did it belong to a perpetrator?
It's completely unclear from the evidence. It's possible it belonged to a perpetrator, or perhaps a third unknown victim. But it's also possible that it was simply a result of contamination.
How so?
It could have been an artifact from the area itself, maybe from a much older historical burial that was disturbed. Or it could have been inadvertently introduced during the long decades of evidence storage. It remains an unexplained variable in the physical evidence, a potential clue or a complete red herring.
So with the girls identified, what is the current status of the investigation into their deaths?
The case remains a very active, open homicide investigation. With the identification complete, the focus has shifted entirely to determining the events of December 16, 1978.
The goal now is to find who did this.
Exactly. The objective is to reconstruct those hours after they were last seen hitchhiking and identify the person or persons responsible for their abduction and murder.
Are there any named suspects or persons of interest?
There are no definitive named suspects,
Right.
but there are several persons of interest based on the era, the location, and the victim profile.
Such as?
Well, one name that always comes up in cases like this from that era is Rodney Alcala, who was known as the dating game killer. He was active during this time and is known to have targeted young women in California.
Okay.
There's also Gerald and Charlene Gallego. They were a couple known for abducting pairs of teenagers in California and Nevada. The victim profile fits, but their timeline of activity is very tight around this period, making it a less certain possibility.
And what about the local serial murders from that time?
You're referring to the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders. This was a series of killings of young women between 1972 and 1976.
And Kerry and Francine certainly fit the profile.
They fitted perfectly. Hitchhiking female teens in the Santa Rosa area. The method of disposal, dumping bodies on rural embankments, is also very similar.
But the timeline is slightly off.
The timeline is the issue. Their disappearance in late 1978 is 2 years after the generally accepted end of that specific series of murders. So police have not officially linked their deaths to that sequence, but the very strong similarities in victimology and method keep it as an active line of inquiry.
This case truly serves as a stark documentation of how a single forensic misclassification can impede an investigation, not just for years, but for decades.
It does, and it also highlights the incredible evolution of forensic anthropology and DNA capability. The science that made the error in 1979 is not the science that solved the case in 2014.
It demonstrates the fragility of an investigation when it relies so heavily on one single erroneous scientific conclusion.
Absolutely. That male classification became a hard fact in the case file
Yeah.
that no one really looked past for over 20 years, not until new technology and new eyes were forced to re-examine it. It's just a tragedy of lost time.
A 36-year wait for answers.
And in the end, it was these two friends who stayed together, who were found together, and after all that time, were finally identified together.
Thanks for listening.